Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this morning's study, and continue looking at Daniel chapter 11. Just kind of briefly go over verse 29 and see where we're going to go today. I've been trying to figure it out. I don't really know. So let's begin with a word of prayer. Dear gracious Heavenly Father, we are thankful for all the things that you show us from your word that reveal to us our need of you and your power and your love and you're working in our lives. And we pray for those that are searching for truth. We know, Lord, that there's many things that we have struggled with, and we know that others struggle to understand your word. But we just pray for your spirit to work in our hearts, in our lives, in our minds, and that as we open your word together here this morning, that you can teach us, that you can instruct us, that you can correct us. Be with us now through thy Spirit, and we also pray for one another. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so yesterday we had gone through Daniel 11, verse 29. Now, Dwight wasn't here. Stephen was, and Stephen said he had a hard time sort of putting this all together. And it's I've tried to figure out the simplest way to explain it. So I'm just going to review it really quickly here, just in as much simplicity as we can have. So we know that in Daniel chapter 11, that it's part of a vision that begins in chapter 10 and continues to the end of chapter 12. And in the past, when we would look at Daniel 11, we would think, well, this is just talking about this history in between the time of, Daniel and basically going up to, the time of the end, right? So going up to 1798 and to 1989. And of course, after that, right? So all that history, the end of the world. Now, we've come to understand that Daniel chapter 11 is addressing Daniel 8 and 9 more in particular. That is the 2300 days or the 2300 evenings and mornings. That is the Marah, the vision of the evenings and mornings, and the Dabar, that is the vision of Daniel chapter 9, the 70 weeks, which addresses the going forth of the commandment. So Daniel has an understanding of that. He has an understanding of the start of these prophetic periods. And the context here is really further understanding of the chazon. That is, he needs to understand what was addressed in Daniel 8:13. How long shall be the vision concerning the daily and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot. And this is not well understood by Seventh-day Adventists. That is, we don't have much of an understanding of the daily, the transgression of desolation or the abomination of desolation. We understand the connection between them, and them also being connected with the indignation, and how the time of the end of the indignation is connected to October 22, 1844. That is, we don't fully understand Millerite history as Seventh-day Adventists. And that's what Daniel 11 is addressing, Daniel 11 and 12. And you can see that when you get to Daniel 12:7, it's going to talk about the 1260 years of the daily. It's going to talk about the 1290 and the 1335 as well. So the latter parts, it's going to deal with that transition from paganism to papalism. It's going to cover the history of Greece and, Persia, Greece, and Rome, pagan and papal. So there's so many things in Daniel chapter 11 that we hadn't really noticed. That is, we knew this basic idea, but we didn't see how they all fit together. And I really think that there is this narrative that flows once you understand the purpose of Daniel chapter 11. The ideas flow a lot better as you move through Daniel 11. Now, of course, we've all studied Daniel 11 in the past. I mean, I studied Daniel 11, many, many times on different levels. I've read Uriah Smith's book on Daniel and Revelation. I've presented studies on it, going through some of it. Obviously, in this movement, we studied Daniel chapter 11, verse 40 to 45. And we've spent a number of different studies that we did. We spent a lot of time on them, dealing with Daniel chapter 11 back in 2020. We did a study, and now we're doing this study again. And I've presented so many studies on it. But each time we look at Daniel chapter 11, we notice things that we didn't notice. Now, one of the things is we notice that it's going to talk about the crucifixion of Christ in Daniel chapter 11. And the purpose of Rome, that Rome has to be the power that establishes the vision, because it is about what's going to happen at the end of the 70 weeks. It's going to be Rome that's going to be there, right? Rome is this power that's going to crucify Christ. And so that's not going to happen with Persia, with Medo-Persia or Persia. And it's not going to happen with Greece, but it is going to happen with Rome, right? Now, one of the things too is in Daniel 11 verse 14, when it says, the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision. We know that that's the chazon. So one of the things that we talked about here is that Daniel chapter 11 is addressing that, the chazon, right? That's the 25-20. Now, when we think of the 25-20, we think of them as two 25-20s. But that's not really correct. I mean, it is correct in one way. I mean, there are two different periods of 25-20 years. But neither of them exists on their own. They're not two separate 25-20s that are unrelated to each other. They are related to each other. And, my view, my understanding of Leviticus 26 is that there is not a 25-20 year period specifically or explicitly referenced there without any relationship to the prophetic periods that are addressing literal Israel. That is, in order to get a 25-20 out of Leviticus 26, you can't just simply take the word 7 times, make it into 7 years, and multiply it by 360. And we think, many people think that that's what Miller did. But it's actually not what Miller did. How did Miller understand the word 7 times? Why did he multiply it by 360? What did he think the 7 times was? And it's not a very good question, because
would we say that that's a structure of 7 prophetic years?
Okay, so how about 7 sabbatical years?
Okay.
So Miller understood, because when he writes about the 25-20, he's going to have this paper, The Typical Sabbaths in the Great Jubilee, right? This paper. And he understands that the sabbatical and jubilee cycle is related to the prophetic periods. One of the reasons why he looked at the end of the prophetic periods as in the fall of 1843, back in May of 1843, suggested it'd be in the fall, is because he understood that there's a jubilee that's connected to the 10th day of the 7th month, and he was looking for periods to end in connection with the jubilee. And This was picked up by Samuel Snow. When that time passed in the fall of 1843, Samuel Snow continued to study, and he came to the conclusion that they were just off by a year. And that the year that's talked about doesn't end in the spring, right? So when they started moving it to the spring, he says, no, this year ends in the fall. And that's the initial idea that Samuel Snow had. But the point is that he understood it not as 7 times, and you take the word times, and that's years, and then you take, that and multiply it by 360. He understood that even though he didn't have, an understanding of Hebrew, but he understood enough to know that 7 was a symbol. Now, he didn't apply 4 different periods of 70 years, or 3 periods of 70 years and one of 140 years, to those periods. He didn't connect it as we did later on. So there's things that he didn't see. But the thing that he didn't do is he didn't say the word times there should be just years, and that we're just going to multiply times. We're going to say that times is 360 years, a day for a year. So he didn't do that. He didn't take it that way, even though it seems like he did. But he understood that there was some steps in between there, but he didn't really show his work, so to speak, as clearly as people would like. So people often have this objection, well, the times is not really part of the text. It's just 7-fold. And so, fold isn't a year. And so you can't take, a prophetic year that's 360 days and then, multiply that and, turn that into years, right? But that's not really what Miller did. Now, I know this is kind of roundabout here, but the point is that when we look at the time of the end and the time appointed, that they are connected, that on the 1843 chart, you have those 45 years, and those are part of that structure. That's the 1290 and the 1335. And that's going to bring you to the first day of the first month in 1844. Right? The 1335, that's blessed is he that waiteth and cometh until the 1335 days. And that's going to be the end of the 1335 days, obviously not the beginning of it. And from there, we would count 187 days to the 10th day of the 7th month. So we have this symbol that we use for July 18, 187, and that becomes part of this structure. So yeah, I said I'm doing something simple, but I'm just trying to give this background information for what's being addressed here. So what's being addressed is the chazon. That is, Daniel has understanding of the 2300 days and the 70 weeks. He doesn't have understanding of the chazon. Why not? Why doesn't he have an understanding of it? He has understanding of the thing, the debar. He has understanding of the vision. Why am I saying he doesn't understand the chazon? Why is Daniel chapter 11 specifically, and chapter 12 as well, giving him an understanding of the chazon? And how do I know that he doesn't? I mean, it says he has an understanding of the debar and of the mareh, but anybody got any thoughts on that? because we know that Rome has to exalt itself to establish the chazon. So why does he not have an understanding of the chazon? And it's going to, in Daniel, it's going to mention the chazon in 8 verse 1 to 2 verses 1 and 2, 8:13, 8:15, right? It came to pass when even I, Daniel, had seen the chazon and sought for the meaning, then behold, there stood before me the appearance of a man. So he's looking for the meaning of the chazon. In 8:26, the vision of the evening and the morning, which was told, is true. That is the vision of that's the Mara. Wherefore shut thou up the vision, the chazon, for it shall be more for many days. Right. So in 8:26, he knows that there's this chazon, but it's going to be shut up. Its understanding is not going to be there. Right. So he sees this chazon, but he doesn't really understand it yet. Right. And the 70 weeks, one of the things they do is they seal up vision and prophecy. And the vision there is the chazon in Daniel 9:24. And in Daniel 9:23, the angel comes to him after his prayer. At the beginning of thy supplications, the commandment came forth, and I am come to show thee, for thou art greatly beloved. Therefore, understand the debar, that is the matter that's going to be presented to him, the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem, and consider the vision, right? So that vision there is going to be the Marah, right? So he's going to consider the bar that is, pardon me, the vision, the Marah, the 2,300 days. So he's going to consider the commandment, the debar, and its relationship to the 2,300 days, to the Marah, right? So in chapter 10, it says he's going to understand both of those. He's going to understand the matter and the Marah. But he doesn't have an understanding of the chazon, right? Okay. So then the next time chazon shows up in Daniel is 11 verse 14, that Rome shall exalt itself to establish the vision. And that vision is the chazon. So can Daniel have an understanding of the chazon without an understanding of the 2 periods of 1,260 years? Because he knows that the 2,300 days are going to end at the time that it's going to be in connection with the end of the prophetic periods, right? So he has an understanding about the 2,300 days, that it's going to be connected to the 70 weeks. But Daniel is writing before any of these things happen. That is, now he may know that the 2520 starts sometime with the captivity of Israel, but he's not going to have a full understanding of this. In order and it's not so much about Daniel, it's about us. Would it be possible for people in the Persian period to know when the chazon is going to end? Because we're given a starting point for the 2,300 days and the 70 weeks. Once those things happen, and then they are fulfilled, the 70 weeks is fulfilled, we then have some understanding about the 2520. You understand what I'm getting at? That there are things that have to unfold in order for Daniel to have an understanding of them. And so he can have these prophecies about it, but Rome has to exalt itself to establish the vision. And so if you look at these verses, so I'm just going to try to help you here to sort of think this through. So here we get Rome exalting itself to establish the vision. We're going to have the end of Greece and the beginning of Rome. And that vision is the chazon, right? Not the vision of the evenings and the mornings, right? It's going to be these visions of the two desolating powers. Now, Rome has to exalt itself in order for this a vision to be established. Now, that word established just means to stand, right? To be appointed, to be confirmed, right? It's authenticating or establishing this vision, this period of time that is the chazon. And so then we have all of this history of Rome, right? So Rome's going to come in at the time that we're going to have these final battles between the king of the north and the king of the south, the battle of Panium. It's going to go through that a little bit, and Rome coming into place, right? And then it's going to talk a bit about the history of Rome in relationship to what happens with Christ, right? So we're going to have these different Caesars, right? Augustus and Tiberius and so forth. And Julius Caesar it's going to talk about as well. And then it's going to talk about the destruction of Jerusalem, which it talks about in Daniel chapter 9. Right, that's the arms of the flood shall be overflown from before him, and he shall be broken, yea, the prince of the covenant. And then it's going to go back and show this league that was made, the Jews made this league with Rome, and how it affects the end of Rome, and then the rise of the papal power, right? So it's gonna address the start of Rome and the end of Rome, and then the rise of the papal power is going to happen with the fall of Rome in Daniel 11 verse 30, right? So it's addressing this history for a purpose. It's not simply, giving us some curiosities or just telling us about some things that happen to show that it's prophecy. It's prophecy with a very clear purpose. It's giving a history that's going to be repeated. So it's using this history typologically. And it's going to talk about this, the Battle of Actium. It's going to talk about the fall of Rome. But in between those, it's going to talk here, at the time appointed, he shall return and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former as the latter. So verse 29 talks about this time appointed that he didn't mention in verse 27. And it's going to talk about what happens in this alliance between Antony and Octavian, that it says, both these kings hearts shall be to do mischief. Right? That is, they both have the same goal. They want to control the world. And they shall speak lies at one table, but it shall not prosper. So obviously that league between them breaks down. But then it says, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed. So the end at the time appointed here is 1798 to 1844. And the word yet just means an iteration, that it's going to occur again. So what's going to happen at the time appointed is not just that it's happening again of what had happened earlier, but it's actually the end of all of this. It's going to be the end of Rome, right? Not just pagan Rome, but papal Rome as well. But it hasn't given you those details yet, okay? Because that's not going to be till verse 31. So then it says, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed. And then it says, then shall he return to his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant. So this is addressing what happens with after the fall of Egypt, and then what's going to happen in this persecution of Jews and Christians. And then he's going to return into his own land. Okay. And then it says, at the time appointed, he shall return and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former or as the latter. So that was the verse that we had addressed. And we're saying that this time appointed can't be 1798 because it's the king of the north coming against the king of the south. And so we looked at that and we couldn't get it to work. And so we've taken the position that this is the time appointed, that is the repeat of the time appointed talked about in verse 27. And so that's going to bring us to the time of the end, which is 1989. And that's what happens in 1989. The king of the north comes toward the king of the south. But here it says, but it shall not be as the former or as the latter. So I know this is a review of yesterday, but we're just going to look at this again and then see where we move from here. So we had three possibilities, or yay, four, right? But the fourth, we had to say it's not correct. So at the time appointed in 1989, the papacy in the USA, the king of the north, shall return. So this is the king of the north coming again toward the south. He shall return, and he's going to come toward the south. So this is Daniel 11, verse 40b, not Daniel 11, verse 40a. But it shall not be as the former, that is the fall of Egypt in 30 BC, in that it is a spiritual north and south and not literal, or as the latter, that is, which means Western, that is the fall of Western Rome from 410 to 476, in that it is not pagan, literal Rome, but papal, spiritual Rome. So here we're just saying that north and south are not literal, they're spiritual, and Rome is not literal, but spiritual, not pagan, but papal. Okay, so that's one interpretation that we could use of that passage. Nothing wrong with this interpretation. It's sort of the first one that I had, because what's going to follow is the fall of Western Rome in verse 30, and we just addressed the fall of Egypt in the preceding verses. But then we looked at it again, and we said, well, we could have it that the latter and the former are different. That while it is the fall of Egypt, it would still be the former, but the latter is not referring so much to the fall of pagan Rome, but to the fall of papal Rome. So it's just a different Rome, and it's just the fall of spiritual Rome, not addressing the fall of literal Rome, right? That is pagan, right? Now, so here it's just saying that it's not like the latter. So we know that the latter is going to be the fall of Western Rome. So here we're going to say that the latter is 1798. So it's the fall of papal Rome. So and so it's not going to be so in the fall of papal Rome, the difference is that north and south are reversed. So that's really the main difference here. So it's not addressing so much the spiritual and literal when we address the latter here as being 1798, but it's addressing the fact that the north and south are reversed. That is, and so that it's just saying that Daniel 11 verse 40, A and B, are these two different times of the ends. And the one in 1989 is like that, except that the north is going to defeat the south, not the south defeat the north. Okay? So that one works just fine as well. So I have nothing wrong with that. I can't think of how that could be wrong, how either of these two options could be wrong. The thing I like about the first one is that it connects it to the fact that we're going to have the fall of literal Rome. But even in the second one, we are going to have the fall of papal Rome being addressed later. So it's going to address both the fall of pagan Rome and papal Rome in the following verses. Right? It's going to bring us up to 1798. So I have no problem with that. Now, the thing is, when I look at the Hebrew, I prefer the translation of the latter part of the verse, but the latter shall not be as the former. So instead of it shall not be as the former or as the latter, while that is a possible translation, this is the most likely. At the time appointed, he shall return and come towards the south, but the latter shall not be as the former. Now, in this case, what it's saying is that the latter is going to be the one in 1989, the time appointed in 1989, and the former is the one that was in 1798. And so it's going to be the same, except the difference is north and south are reversed. So this one just basically is using the idea that the latter is not like the former, right? Where the other one says it's not like the former or the latter, right? So you can see it has the same information that's essential to understand the difference between 1798 and 1989. So again, I have no problem with this interpretation. Now, it's my preference based on my understanding of the Hebrew, and I just think it's a much more natural reading. But the other readings are fine. None of these contradict one another. They all give us the same information, just looking at it from a different perspective. Now, if we try to apply it where this is talking about 1798, well, in 1798, the king of the north does not return and come against the king of the south. So this one doesn't work. Okay. Any questions on this before we move on? Okay.
Why were you placing this with the north and the south being reversed?
In 1989?
Right.
Well, because the former is 1798, where the king of the north is going to be taken captive by the king of the south. In 1989, the king of the south is the one that loses.
Okay.
So it's just simply that there are two times appointed that are mentioned. The one is Daniel 11, verse 40a and verse 27. And in verse 29, it's Daniel 11, verse 40b. And it's just going to tell us that this repeat of history, that the second part of Daniel 11, verse 40b, is different in that it's whoever who's winning the battle is reversed. So does that make sense?
Okay, I was asking to try to understand so that I'd be able to fit all this together.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so each one of these tells us basically the same information. You know, you can say one tells us more and one tells us a bit less, but they're all in agreement. There's nothing that's contradictory between those three interpretations. Daniel 11, verse 29, if we say that the time appointed is 1798, well, I can't see how that applies. You know, the papacy doesn't come towards France, right? France comes towards the papacy. And then trying to say how it's not like the former is the latter, well, you know, it could kind of work, but the thing is, it doesn't. The whole verse doesn't work in interpreting it that way. Now, we know that Uriah Smith deals with the time appointed as the end of the 360, right? So he has a different interpretation on it. Okay. So now that we have those verses and we look at verse 30, so this is just going to address the fall of pagan Rome. But it shows at that time that pagan Rome is going to have intelligence with them that forsake the Holy Covenant. So we know that pagan Rome doesn't really fall in the way that like Rome does not end, right? Rome continues. Now we know Western Rome technically falls, but the papacy takes it over. And so that transition from paganism to papalism is described in the next verse. The taking away of the daily and the giving of the abomination of desolation. Right? So this is when arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength. They shall take away the daily, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. Now, we haven't put in the present truth application of this verse. Now, the verse above, so if we go to verse 29, I said that we can't put a present truth application in this verse. That is, it is the present truth. The only thing we could parallel it to, and maybe we should look at that, is, where it says, at the time appointed, November 9th, 1989, he, the papacy of the USA, the king of the north, shall return and come towards the south. But the latter shall not be as the former, in that the north and the south are reversed. So one of the things we noticed is we have these waymarks that address the king of the north and the king of the south in our history. And we call them what? What are the waymarks that we mark where we say the king of the south defeats the king of the north, and then the king of the north defeats the king of the south? What do we call those waymarks? What's the name we give to them?
Onium and raffia.
Okay, so you got Raphia and Panium, right? And we've come to understand. So one of the things that we saw that it's kind of odd that we didn't really see this before. At least I don't remember seeing it until we started doing this study on Daniel 11. Is that 1798 is Raphia and 1989 is Panium, right? We come to see that now, that's what they are. But we have them as waymarks in our line. That is, when we look at them in our line, they are a repeat of history. Right? So 1798 and 1989 repeat in our history within our line as what we call Raphia and Panium, and we mark them as midnight and the midnight cry. Okay, so that's where they are. And so we know that we have this line, which we've had since 2016, of 9/11, midnight cry, Sunday law. And we kept talking about, we're approaching midnight, and then we would have some event, we'd pass it. We said, well, that was midnight, the midnight cry is coming. November 9th, 2019 was supposed to be the midnight cry for the priests, but then it was supposed to be, midnight for the Levites, right? So there was going to be this north and south, and the north and south had to be the United States and Russia again, like it was in 1989. But that wasn't really consistent, right? So and Jeff eventually abandoned that. So as we move through this history, we're trying to address these waymarks, and we can even mark January 6th, 2021, the siege of Washington. We can mark it as the Battle of Raphia, but it's still not the midnight on the line that Jeff had back in 2016. And we've come to see that waymark called midnight is a little bit more elusive. And what is it that we're expecting then with this waymark of the actual midnight waymark that we labeled as Raphia? So what is it that we're expecting midnight to be like? And this is, it's a difficult question. And this is sort of, people might have different ideas of what they think midnight was supposed to be like or what it's going to be like.
we're expecting America to be defeated by Russia, and then in the aftermath, Russia to be defeated by America.
Okay, so there's these ideas about United States and Russia, but we've abandoned that view, right? So we now recognize that Russia is not the king of the South, that it has to do with the globalists, right? They've taken on that role as the king of the South because it's atheism, and Russia is not an atheistic country. It's a Christian country now, right? So it can't be Russia. And now we can say, well, the United States is the king of the North. So, apostate Protestantism, things like that. So you have this, you could say this, it's the dragon power, United Nations. But what are we expecting? Are we expecting an actual battle between these powers? Or is there something else going on? Because if we look in Millerite history and we look at midnight, well, midnight is just midway. It's going to be when Samuel Snow rides his horse into Boston, doesn't ride it into Exeter, comes into Boston, rides, from early in the morning, gets there sometime, maybe around noon or so, and he's going to just give a brief message regarding the 10th day of the 7th month. Right? He's going to say that he's giving the midnight cry, and it's midnight now, not recognizing that it's actually to the day midnight. But so that's going to be Boston. So he's going to proclaim a message, and then the midnight cry. There's not a battle going on or anything. There's no North against the South. In the midnight cry, there's going to be, just the empowerment of this message that Samuel Snow had. So why are we looking at Raphi and Panium typifying waymarks, or being typified by waymarks, however you want to look at it, that occurred in Millerite history called Midnight and the Midnight Cry? Why are we attaching this as a battle between the North and the South? How does this relate? Because one really is an external thing, that when we're attaching this battle of Raphi, I don't think it would apply to something happening within the movement. If, as far as a battle. Okay, so Samuel has no idea. That's good. Good to be honest. Okay. So the way that we understand this is we go back to the Battle of Raphi and the Battle of Panium in the history of Daniel chapter 11. And we can see that those are typifying 1798 and 1989. Now, if that's true, 1798 and 1989 are Raphi and Panium, respectively. In what line? Right? Normally, we would have 1798 is the time of the end. And, maybe this line, we should try drawing it out. But I think it would be in a line where you're going to have the time of the end as something before 1798. And you might even say, well, it's the time of the end for Western Rome. Maybe that's the time of the end. And then you have this tarrying time. And at the end of that tarrying time, you're going to have the papacy being taken captive, right? The tarrying time's a time of confusion, or whatever you want to call it. And then you have Millerite history. That's the period between midnight and the midnight cry. The midnight cry would then be, the message regarding, the second coming of Christ, or whatever that would be, the end of the prophetic periods. I mean, you could do something like that. But the question as to what we are expecting to happen is, I don't think we know what's going to happen. That is, what midnight and midnight cry are going to look like. Now, I do think that we would need to understand these things as symbols. That is, they are symbolizing something. So raffia has a symbol. It's in 2017, right? 2017, 217 BC, not 2017 BC. And that's a symbol of July 21st, the 21st of July. So we have this symbol, and we can tie it to Millerite history. But yet nothing in Millerite history happens that's a parallel to the Battle of Raphia that we know of, right? That we've addressed. We haven't said, yeah, in Boston is just like Raphia. And yet we've attached the symbol of Raphia to midnight. Now, it could be that when we talk about midnight in the midnight cry in our line, that is the line that we have from 9/11, midnight cry, Sunday law, that we shouldn't be expecting the Battle of Raphia at that midnight. It could be that when we started understanding Raphia and its application, that maybe that should just be attached to January 6th. That is a midnight in our line. And it is going to be the Democrats, the king of the South, defeating the Republicans, the king of the North. So there we do have something that is the North and the South. Now, if we were going to have something that's the North and the South, and we were going to mark it as a future date that we call midnight, I mean, who would be the North and who would be the South? It definitely is not going to be Russia and the United States. And I know a lot of people are still trying to look to that. They're trying to look to this Ukrainian war as something to do with Russia and the United States. But Russia's not the king of the South. So you need something that is representative of the king of the South. Now, you could say, well, maybe it's some kind of clash between the UN and the United States. And that would make more sense, right? So, because in a sense, we already have that with January 6th. And part of what I have seen is that we have seen through wokeism and through, the promotion of the World Economic Forum and their agenda as something that definitely parallels Raphia. And then the idea is that Paneum would be when the Republicans conquer the Democrats in much the same way that happened. That is, it's going to end the Democrats. Now, and sometimes we see it, well, maybe it has to do with the Civil War in the United States. The North against the South, so to speak, right? So we have lots of different options of ways that we could look at it. It could have nothing to do with the North and South when we get to the waymark midnight. It might just be something that has applied already. And that, because we know the thing about midnight in Millerite history is it's more about a proclamation of a message. So to know exactly what that's going to mean as far as proclaiming a message, our view is that we're going to have a message that we give to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, right? And there would be some events, such as July 18th, that would have opened up the doors for that to happen. So if we're going to address, this idea of Raphia and Paneum, they may not necessarily line up with the midnight and the midnight cry in Jeff's line, but they might, right? I'm just saying, we don't know. We know that we do have a Raphia that we can mark already. And that may just have been where the Raphia and Paneum application would line up as being midnight and the midnight cry, having to do with our line internally within this movement. marked by an external event, but not on the big line. So, I mean, that would be the real difference that we have in the movement right now, if you want to just take away all the other differences. But in the understanding of the lines, we do not believe we have come to midnight yet. That there is all of this work to do in this movement because we're in a typical line that precedes midnight. In a sense, you can say what we're in right now is the prediction before midnight. We're in Samuel Snow's letters. We're not to Boston yet. Now, Boston is going to be a proclamation of a message to Seventh-day Adventists. And then there's going to be an empowerment of that message later on. And in the empowerment of that message, many, many Adventists are going to join in that message, right? And that has to all happen before there's a Sunday law. So we have all of these different scenarios that are happening in this movement. And I know I'm making this a little bit confusing for something that's supposed to be simple. But, you know, I've been writing a paper on the eclipse that's coming up in 2 weeks. And I watched Don Frost's video on it, Nineveh and Nashville. I watched part 1 and part 2. Now he's working for Amazing Discoveries now, which I find odd. That they could take him seriously, but anyway, there's a lot of people who are looking at these different events like eclipses and wars that are going on, and presenting sort of scenarios of how they think things are going to happen. And that's happening within the movement as well. Right. So Jeff is making suggestions about the war with Ukraine and so forth. And, you know, Trump becoming elected and you know, what's going to happen. So Trump is coming back, you know, there's all of these speculations. How do we avoid getting caught up in these speculations? I mean, because they're tempting, right? You know, if you start looking into this eclipse and the eclipse back in 2017, and you start looking at, you know, previous eclipse and the earthquake, you know, in New Madrid back in 1811, you know, things like that. You look at the eclipse that happened just before that. You know, people have all these kinds of speculations. So what's keeping us on the correct course here?
By the right understanding of lines.
Okay, so we have an understanding of lines. Okay, so that's extremely important. That is, we have accepted the light in the past, and that light in the past is giving us in our history a structure that we can now look at, and we can say, well, I know we haven't gone to this point yet, right? That we know that the Sunday law is not just around the corner this summer or something like that, or this, you know, winter, or right. There are so many things that have to happen, so much work that needs to be done. And then, of course, we have, you know, this eclipse is going to go over Nashville. Last time it went over Memphis, the one in 2017. This one's going to go through Tennessee as well, but they're going to experience it in Nashville. So Memphis and Nashville are both these important centers for country music of some sort. You know, and of course we got the Parthenon in Nashville, and we have Ellen White's prophecy about the destruction of Nashville. And so, you know, we could create a scenario and say, well, you know, what's going to happen is sometime after this eclipse, there's going to be maybe an earthquake, and maybe, you know, maybe Nashville is going to be destroyed by a fireball. That might happen. And then, Trump will be put as the head of the United States and he's going to bring in a Sunday law. I mean, we could create scenarios like that, right? But is that what we're supposed to do?
No.
No. And we know that because of our experience and the lines that we have, right? That is, if we get rid of those lines, and I don't fully understand Jeff's statement where he said, the biggest mistake or the first mistake or whatever that we made was looking at this midnight waymark. So the midnight waymark was a huge mistake. If we get rid of that, we have no foundation to stand on, right? We could just start speculating left and right. We could say, well, we can't time set, but we could be, event setting. Trump's going to bring in the Sunday law. Trump's going to become a dictator. That's going to happen between, the Russians with the war in Ukraine, but they would all be speculation. Like, there would not be anything solid for us to build on. And people do this all the time. Don Frost does it all the time. He creates some scenario, things don't work out that way. Well, he keeps his options open too, the way that he does it. But we know that God has been leading us and that we can't abandon this. So when we have these three different interpretations of this text, they give us something quite solid. At the mouth of two or three witnesses, we can establish that 1989 and 1798 are connected. We can establish that our understanding of Daniel 11 verse 40 is correct, that it's already witnessed to earlier in Daniel chapter 11, something that we had never noticed before. And then we can now evaluate these lines based upon our own history that we have passed through. So I guess the thing that I want to do, so here we have up at the top of this page here, we have the present truth application up to verse 28. Now, we're saying that this history in verse 29 is talking about our history, but that we can examine this in the context of not just the broader line, but a narrower line, right? So if we're going to take November 9th, 1989, we know that this is going to parallel November 9th, 2019, right? Can we agree on that? And in doing that, we can see that there is going to be a battle that occurs. And now in this case, so we're taking November 9th, 2019. Does the king of the north come against the king of the south on November 9th, 2019? Now here it's, the papacy in the USA is the king of the north. He shall return and come toward the south. So what happens in this movement on November 9th, 2019? How could we take this and make an application to our history? We talked about it a little bit, a week or so ago.
It's when we got 30 years of ministry, in our ministry, like of ministering as Christ was grown up, and then he could, like, he had freedom to go and start preaching. Like, that's what happened on November 9th, 2019.
Okay, so what we have is the 30 years, right? Christ is now baptized. That's what you're saying. He can be the high priest or be a priest.
Yeah.
Okay, he begins his ministry. Okay, so on November 9th, 2019, we're going to have a battle between the North and the South as well. So normally we would look at the North. They're neither necessarily good or bad. Okay, they're both, Greece initially, right? You're going to be, apostate Protestantism and the Soviet Union, and apostate Protestantism connected with the papacy. So it's obviously, that's why it's apostate. It's not really Protestantism. Being the king of the North. But if we were going to put it into our history, we'd have to say this is FFA, right? That is, FFA is going to come against Parminder's movement, right? And, we could have said, Alpha and Omega and so forth, but I'd just rather put Parminder in here. And now remember, we also have the prophetic mirror. I'm just going to also put Tess.
Hello, excuse me. But
Yeah.
I think the collision between FFA and Pamina's movement came after November 9th, 2019.
Came after? Well, it's going to happen before, right? Parminder and Tess are going to be before November 9th, 2019. Okay. So they're going to be, because that's going to be like August 29th, 2019. They have the rebellion and so forth. But what I'm saying, right? So what I'm saying is that FFA is going to, we could put even like September 7th. It kind of begins, but I'm just going to put that this is sort of the showdown. This is the date that was set that parallels it, and they're going to be defeated, right? So that is, Parminder and Tess are going to be defeated in our lines, and but then it says it shall not be as the former. Now, so in order to understand what the former would be, and the latter, that would be obviously different. We're not going to be going back to Egypt, in 30 BC being defeated. There would have to be something earlier in our movement. Now that's why this last one is where it says, and the latter shall not be as the former. That is, the former would have been 1989. But North and South aren't reversed, so we'd have to, we would have something like that. It's internal, not external, something like that. So in each one of these, we could probably make an application of the latter and the former. But the basic idea here is that we have this wokeism. This is the South. This is a type of atheism, we'll call it that. A worldliness that FFA is going to attack. Now, FFA, and it's not, doesn't mean FFA is good or bad, right? Because we're talking about the papacy in the USA. One of the ways in that they're reversed, though, is in the Civil War. That's the point I was going back to. Remember, we have a civil war in 742 BC. It's the North against the South. And who's Confederate?
So
The North.
Yeah, the North is going to be Confederate. And in 1863, who's going to be Confederate?
the South.
The South, right? So there's a reversal happening. And so here you can kind of see that there's, if you're going to compare this, it would just say that there's a reversal in the sense of North and South, just like you would have in that that comparison, like who's Confederate. So here we have Parminder and Tess, instead of where the North is going to have the papacy in the USA. It has two. In this case, the king of the South the USSR has one, but Parminder and Tess have two. Does that make sense? Like there's a combined of two, because you got two combined in the above one, papacy in the US, but it's not FFA and somebody else. And in the South, which is just one, the USSR, now we have the two, Parminder and Tess. And that would be a way which it's the latter is not as the former. And so you'd just be comparing the present truth application with the literal or the historical application. So that's the way that I would do that. Now, all this is addressing is that history, right? It's going to address November 9th, 2019. It's not going to address the rest of the line in verse 29. Okay. So when we get to verse 30, and it says, in which the ships of Kittim shall come against him, therefore he shall be grieved and return and of indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do, he shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. Now there's two things happening here. He's going to return, have indignation against the holy covenant, and then so shall he do. And then it says, he shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. So historically, obviously, this is the persecution of Christians, and then the intelligence or the communication of this working with apostate Christianity. So we have two groups here, the Holy Covenant, that's God's true church, and those that forsake the Holy Covenant. So first, paganism is going to persecute Christians, but then it's also going to have intelligence with this other group that professes to be Christians. Okay. Now, how would we apply this in a present truth sense? So we looked at verse 29. So now we get to verse 30. And what parallel would the ships of Kittim have to do with our history? Are we going to just bring this into our history? Are we going to continue verse 29 with verse 30? That's saying that this has to do with something within our movement? And what would the ships of Kittim, how would they parallel something that happened to our movement? And then, Western Rome, what is Western Rome typifying? Is that typifying some aspect of our movement? Are we going to do that? Or are we going to take this and bring it in the broader context? That is, are we going to sort of separate this from verse 29 and just have this as applying historically, or not historically, but in the present truth sense, taking this history of the fall of pagan Rome and paralleling with the fall of the United States more directly, right? That's what we would have to decide. So I like to think that verse 29 is parenthetical, that it's not really connected to the flow of these prophecies in the way that that we would just take it and put it into a line. It's just going to typify this history, which we call 1989 or November 9th, 1989. It's going to take that history and it's going to typify our history, just in a very, it's not going to go through the detail of it. It's not going to deal with July 18th. It's not going to deal with December 25th. It's not going to deal with anything else. It's just that's the only way that I could parallel it. I can't create a new line with verse 29. But you can see how this would fit in the context of what we're talking about in the other present truth applications. We can just see that November 9th has this role that is this, and November 9th is really about all of this addressing July 18th and December 25th. It's just not the line, because verse 29 is not part of the line. right? It's looking way into the future to the time of the end in our history, and it's just put in there, right? To address the fact that there is this history is going to be repeated, right? It's telling you about Daniel 11 verse 40b, because the first part's going to tell you about Daniel 11 verse 40a. Okay, so then when we get to verse 30, we are starting a new line. Now, it's going to be the fall of pagan Rome, and verse 31 is going to give us the rise of papal Rome historically, right? But those would have to be paralleled in our history. And so we would have to figure out, well, what's the rise of papal Rome paralleling? It's probably paralyzing something too, but and then what is the fall of pagan Rome symbolizing? Okay, so because we need to have a present truth application, at least that's what we believe. So the simple thing is we're going to say the ships of Kittim, what are they going to parallel in our history? Now you could say, well, I'm just going to go back here. So we know that this is 1989, but this is telling us something about the future. But it could just be telling us that these verses here, verses 30 and onward, are history that's going to be repeated in 1989. So it could be telling us that these ships of Kittim coming against Western Rome are typifying something that's going to happen in 1989. Does that make sense? I mean, we already believe that, right?
Well, Ellen White, she has already commentated and said saying this history is going to be repeated.
Yeah. And all I'm saying is that verse 29 is telling us that. Verse 27 to 29. So the history that's going to be repeated is this history that's going to be described. And that's going to be, as verse 29 is telling us, is that this is that repeat of history. It's November 9th, 1989. So it's telling us that the present truth application of verse 30 is 1989. Would you agree with that, Stephen?
I don't see any relation to 1989 in the verse.
In verse 29 or in verse 30?
Verse 30.
Okay, so what are the ships of Kittim? Okay, we're going to have the fall of Western Rome, right?
Yes.
So what is Western Rome symbolizing?
United States.
Okay. So it's going to represent the United States. What aspect of the United States? Are you going to want to have the ships of Kittim do you want to have all of this address the Sunday law? Or is it going to address the history leading up to the Sunday law?
Well, I see it as relating to the formation of the image of the beast.
Okay. So the formation of the image of the beast. And when does that start?
Well, I suppose you could maybe relate it to Ronald Reagan.
Okay. Right. So that's what I'm saying. Now, when I say 1989, I don't mean the year 1989. Right? I just mean that history that marks the beginning of 1989, the time of the end. Okay. Does that make sense?
Right, okay.
Okay. Now, so we're going to take, we know that the ships of Kittim are these Germanic tribal invasions. And I didn't see any Germanic tribal invasions happening in that history. But we're not looking for literally Germanic tribal invasions. This has to typify something. So what do the ships of Kittim symbolize in our history?
Well, they are a trumpet power. So they
Okay.
signify the trumpet power in our history.
Okay, and what's the trumpet power?
It's the seventh trumpet.
Okay, the seventh, which sounds October 22nd, 1844.
Began then? Yes.
Yeah, it began then. So are you going to attach it to the wool?
9/11.
Okay, so we do have 9/11, and we mark 9/11, that's going to be a restraint of Islam, right? Was Islam involved prior to 9/11?
Yes.
Yeah, right. So we know that Islam is part of that history. And we can go to the Soviet-Afghan War, say 1979. But in the 1970s, we already have these disturbances occurring, right? So, I mean, is there some way that we can attach the ships of Kittim to Islam? Is there a way to do that?
Well, America was initially supporting Islam against their war against Russia.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, Islam is a broad thing. There's different factions and so forth. But so we have, let me see here. So I don't remember the years of all this, but okay. So the first thing that you're going to have is the Ayatollah Khomeini back in the 1970s. Now, exactly how did he? I mean, Dwight might remember some of this history better because he's older than me and paid more attention than I did. But we're going to have the Ayatollah Khomeini. So that's in Iran, right?
Yes.
Correct.
Okay. And there's going to be, so we're going to have the start of Islamic terrorism occurring. Now, I mean, it's in the news, but it's not directly affecting us. I mean, you'd hear about airplanes being hijacked or bombings happen, and there'd be the odd thing here and there. But I mean, it's not really till 9/11 that they really catch our attention. Even the bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993 on February 26th, because it so soon, Waco followed 2 days later. It sort of drew our attention away from Islam. Everybody forgot about it, right? It wasn't, if people had paid more attention to the investigation that followed and so forth, there might have been a lot more interest in what was happening and much more concern about Islam. But it's not going to be until 2001 that really the fear strikes everyone. Okay, so some of this stuff we're going to have to look at tomorrow in a lot more detail. So we'll just try to keep it more general here. So we can say that this is part of the fall of the United States, that the ships of Kittim can represent Islam. Now, obviously there's not a direct correlation in the sense of the area and so forth, because Kittim, this is going to be in the Mediterranean, Islam's way over further east. I mean, they do take over a lot of that territory later on, but we're not making those connect geographical locations. We're just saying that there is that Western Rome is going to fall, and they're going to have a trumpet power that comes in and causes them to fall. And Islam is going to be a trumpet power as well, right? It's going to be under the trumpets. And so we can apply that parallel. Now, in this case, then it says, shall come against him, and then therefore he shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the Holy Covenant. So one is, you see three things here. The grieving, the returning, and the indignation. So what do we notice about these three things? What's the most obvious thing about these three things?
The indignation.
Okay. Well, the first obvious thing is there's three of them. Okay. Yeah. So we have this indignation, and we know the indignation here is going to be the 1260 years. But we have three things: grieved, return, and indignation. So that represents three angels' messages, right?
All right.
Okay. And I'm doing something here at the same time. Okay, that doesn't. Okay, so we got this these three. So could we apply these as the three angels' messages in our time? Could we put grieved as November 9th, 1989, as the return as September 11th, 2001, and the indignation as the Sunday law? So could we do that? How would we address these three? How would we place them in our history? Is there some other way that we could take this? So the one thing is, I added up grieved, return, and indignation, and I get this number 13431. So it's it's the reverse, right? 13431. Now that's a period of 36 years. And 282 days. I don't know, what could we connect it to? I mean, if we're gonna have the ships of Kittim, is there some date that we can connect it to it in that history? I mean, the start of the Afghan war, I tried. That's just going to bring us to the first day of the 7th month in 2016, if I count from the start of the war in 1979, December 26th. It's December 26th the war starts.
I think it's
24th.
24th.
Yeah. So it's the 24th. Yeah. So that would just bring us to the 28th day of the 6th month on the biblical calendar in 2016, October 1st. So I don't see any. Is there some other event that we would mark as the ships of Kittim? I mean, maybe there's some other attack that occurs. What's the first Islamic? There is November 5th, 1990. Yeah, what is this? What about that? Yeah, so I tried February 26, 1993. Well, we're gonna have to come back to this tomorrow and just try to figure out how we're gonna mark this. Don't understand why that's not working. Sorry about that. Okay, so if I go backwards from April 5th, 2030, 13,431 days, it brings me to June 26, 1993. That's the number of days between these two dates. And in 1993, on June 26, Bill Clinton ordered US warships stationed in the Persian Gulf and in the Red Sea to launch Tomahawk cruise missiles against the headquarters of the Iraqi intelligence service in downtown Baghdad. So I don't know much about that history, but maybe we could look at that tomorrow, see if we can make some kind of connection, whether that's important or not. Okay, let's close with prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for the study this morning, and we just pray for your continued presence throughout this day. I pray for each person who's been studying and looking for truth, that you can guide them. We ask for your angels' care and protection over our loved ones, and that you can give us strength for the trials that we face each day. We ask that we can continue to study and to understand these things and to make a correct application. And bring us together again according to thy will is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.